All right, good evening. My name's Carolyn Merrick, and I'm the program coordinator here at the center. Since 1960, the center has successfully pursued its mission to positively impact our community by creating opportunities for healthy aging for people 50 and better. To meet this mission, we provide community members with opportunities to connect with others for social support, emotional wellness, and for fun. To challenge themselves to grow intellectually, physically, spiritually, and creatively, and to contribute to our shared community. Tonight's online programming is one of the 60 offered at the center each week. We offer both online and on-site programming. Enid Krieger, our center member and member of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee, will introduce the final speaker of our series, Dr. Frank Dukes. Enid is the person responsible for these speaker series and for procuring our many wonderful speakers. So thank you, Enid, for your tireless good work. Again, if you have a question or comment for Dr. Dukes, please use the chat feature. Enid will monitor the chat and then ask Dr. Dukes your questions or give him your comments when the presentation is complete. We'll also ask you to fill out a brief survey at the end of the presentation. Your feedback matters to us, so thank you. And now, Enid Krieger.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And it's hard to believe that we're coming to the end of this series. I'm going to miss all of you so much when this is over. Well, over the past 5 weeks, I think we've heard some pretty powerful presentations, right? I think you'll all agree. And it's pretty evident that those presentations have highlighted the fact that people of color have been intentionally excluded from the hallmarks of American democracy, specifically opportunity, freedom, and prosperity. But here at the center, we see it as more of an oversight than an intentional exclusion. So we're doing all of these things so that we can have an impact on our community and the center itself in terms of the elimination of racism and bias. This speaker series is a starting point. The surveys that you completed each Wednesday evening and your comments would suggest to me that the presentations have been eye-openers for you in many ways. And as I said last week, I would like to believe that they've spurred you to want to do something, to act, to eradicate this legacy of racism in our community especially, and anywhere else where we find it. Even if that means simply speaking up when you hear something that's not acceptable. The speaker series is the beginning, and I can think of no better person to bring it to an end than this evening's speaker. Dr. Frank Dukes earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia and an MS and Ph.D. from George Mason University. He's an author, lecturer, and distinguished fellow at UVA. He's a mediator and a facilitator, and he has mediated many, many environmental conflicts, including work in tobacco communities, the coal fields of Appalachia, and the Chesapeake Bay watershed. He's written several books and articles about conflict resolution and environmental and racial issues. He's the founder of UCARE, which stands for University and Community Action for Racial Equity. This is an organization or group that addresses UVA's legacy of white supremacy and helps UVA and the Charlottesville community work together to seek ways to repair that legacy. Dr. Dukes was on the design team for UVA's Memorial to Enslaved Laborers. And if you all have not gone to visit that, you're missing something. You need to make that trip. He's also on the Charlottesville Commission determining the fate of the city's Confederate statues. And he co-leads planning for what many people hope will be Central Virginia's Truth and Transformation Commission. He's on the board of a national anti-hate group entitled Not in Our Town. This is a movement to stop hate, address bullying, and build safe, inclusive communities for everybody. And most importantly, he is extremely proud to wear the label anti-racist. And I am honored to introduce Dr. Frank Dukes.
Thank you so very much, Enid. And I'm honored to be able to be here, and what a gift to see so many people, so many friends that I know and so many people that I do not know, but I'm so glad to be able to do that. And I'm gonna begin, and I'm so glad to see Mary Wilson. She's here, and also last week reminding us that Indigenous peoples are very much present So we are on land that was occupied by the Monacan peoples. They're still here, right? And they're still thriving. They still are working together to make their stories told and their histories told too. I live just down the street from the center, and we are on land that was once owned by Amy Bowles Farrow, a woman of color who purchased 224 acres in the late 1700s. Quite remarkable. So this talk is dedicated to those who cannot tell their own stories. Thanks also Enid Krieger and all of the Center for Belvedere people for hosting this series. How many of you have already been to one of those talks? You could just raise your hand if you've been to one. See, yeah, lots of people that have done that. I've learned so much from Jordy Yeager, helping us understand how our racial history has shaped pretty much every aspect of our present. And his focus, of course, was on neighborhoods and housing. And I'm going to be following up on that a little bit later. And Lisa Drain, Harold Foley, Tamara Wilkerson, Chantel Bingham made it very personal. And I'm still haunted by Lisa's question of what is a mother to do? And we'll be asking us all, what are we to do? And I will be offering some answers before concluding my talk. And Dr. Beverly Adams, she demonstrated how subtle acts of exclusion are more than microaggressions, how they may have major impacts. One set of impacts, I think, is on infant mortality, and I'll be talking a little bit about that later too. And then Dean Alejandro Hernandez offered another personal story of his family, and especially his father's role in working with Cesar Chavez, helping us understand the power of extended commitment in the face of what looks like defeat. And I was struck by a number of comments you made, but one comment in particular, that it is fear and lack of hope that they saw as their greatest obstacle, the people that we're trying to organize. So how much do fear and loss of hope play a role today? As Mary Wilson pointed out last week with Pope Alexander VI, the 1493 papal bull or statement, at times the narrative of white supremacy asserted that indigenous people were less than fully human. And certainly that was extended to Africans and eventually African Americans, by much of the church, by many other people as well. And this is what I'm hoping to unpack today. Where did these stories come from? What is the harm that they do, and what can we do to change them? So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully this is going to be showing here and be able, and I'm going to move you all over so I'm not necessarily seeing everybody. And just to see where we are here, one of Mary Bowles' descendants with the cemetery that's right here, and then Free State, great history to be able to learn. So what I'm going to be doing, first I'm going to talk about some of the key takeaways I would love to have people leave with, and then talk about what we mean when we say white supremacy, and the difference between a white supremacist and the structure and the system of white supremacy. And then the epidemic of bad storytelling, that part of the title that I have. I'm going to focus on the narratives of white supremacy, the stories of white supremacy, and what they have tried to do, how they've been resisted, and also then the harms that they bring, continuing racial harms that they have, and then finally concluding with what we can do, or what can we do. So the key takeaways that I would like for people to do, one is this idea that white supremacy is deeply ingrained everywhere in our country, in our neighborhoods, in our laws, economy, and so forth, and in our landscapes as well. And it leaves deep racial injustices and racial disparities and harms all of us. Certainly the harms are more pernicious for people of color, but they harm people that are white certainly as well. Loss of friendship, loss of community, loss of contributions by African Americans who were denied education or denied rightful place in the community. And look at how much has been contributed despite this racial harm, but also this idea of white guilt and the constant burden of maintaining a broken system. So we all benefit by challenging it. And then that there are numerous false narratives, bad stories we hear and tell about ourselves that justify and continue to sustain white supremacy despite all our efforts to confront it. And then recognizing, understanding how these disparities happen, how harmful they continue to be, is crucial for us to overcome them. So this can be a challenging, hour for us, well, a little bit more than an hour for us to be able to be. So people feel free anytime to take a breath, feel free to turn off your screen, and remind yourself of why you're here. Everybody here because you care about making this a better community, a stronger community. And the only way for us to do so is for us really to be able to confront our history. And finally, the last takeaway, that racial disparities are everyday knowledge for most people of color, but that's not all of their lives. So are their lives of resilience, lives of resistance they've made, lives of community building, that they are much more than the harm that is done to them. And just one example of that, the memorial to enslaved laborers, shortly after it was constructed, served as a place for people in the medical center at the University of Virginia to be able to come and dedicate themselves to ending racial disparities in medicine. This was done a couple days after the murder of George Floyd, and people saying, enough, we're not going to allow these harms to continue. So what is meant by white supremacy? So the term commonly used by white, European, and North American leaders in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So make a distinction between white supremacists, those who openly advocate the superiority of whiteness, and the idea of this system, it's cultural, legal, economic, that developed over centuries to actually advantage whites over others. Elizabeth Martinez, in her paper, What is White Supremacy?, defines it this way. White supremacy is a historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and peoples of color by white peoples and nations of the European continent for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. They've been powerful sustainers of racial injustice for centuries, and everybody participates in the system no matter your intent. And this was very common. Nowadays, to be called a white supremacist, of course, is a term that most of us, everybody on this call, certainly wants to avoid. But in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, it was very commonplace for this to be, for those who are white, to be able to name white supremacy as something to aspire to. So what are narratives? So again, the epidemic of bad storytelling, and I'm using a term narratives that's a little bit more common than stories, because stories sometimes sounds like fiction that are made up. Narratives can be made up, but they also are ways that we understand our world. So narratives can be expressed in storytelling, but stories can also be told about us in art and music and place and building names and literature, classes and textbook, laws, public policies, and of course, monuments and memorials. Now, narratives are not necessarily bad. They can make us feel proud about who we are. They bind people with diverse interests together. They teach us lessons about who we should emulate and who we should refute. And they help us navigate right and wrong, and they help us face challenges together. But they also may develop these stories we tell each other to demean others, to justify harm, or provide public cover for private gain. So a common example that everybody knows is the narrative in Nazi Germany that the Jews were the enemies of other Germans of the Third Reich. And that narrative eventually allowed thousands of non-Jewish Germans to take away Jewish rights, to plunder Jewish property, and eventually to murder millions of Jews. But this narrative, in the absence of sufficient challenge to it, enabled millions of German citizens who didn't participate in that, nonetheless to look away as those murders occurred. Not all narratives are intended to demean other people, but they may be harmful nonetheless. So the bottom one here, this idea of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan, the sort of epitome for the Nazis of what they consider to be the epitome of the human race. And more currently, variation of Pepe, a well-known alt-right meme by white supremacists, and a way of kind of attracting people who see this image as kind of clever, and that these people actually are, able to use cartoons to be able to recruit people. And of course, in Charlottesville, one of our most powerful narratives is the role that Jefferson and Madison Monroe played in the formation of our independence, our Constitution, our Republic, as well as in the creation of the University of Virginia. So narratives of white supremacy, again, it was a term commonly used by white leaders in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries as the way things needed to be. And it drew on such sources as the Bible and religious leaders. So again, Mary Wilson pointing out Pope Alexander VI, and of course, many other religious leaders. The declarations of science, and we'll be looking at in a minute, one of the leading scientists at the University of Virginia and some of his statements. The drive for profit, of course, and people like Ibram Kendi noting that these narratives actually arose to defend the institution of slavery. So not necessarily like, oh, we have these narratives about that Black people are less valuable than white people and therefore we can enslave them. It was more the economic opportunity that then created the justification that we needed with that type of narrative. The arts and the proclamations of leading white community leaders. So one of those, people may remember the Behringer Wing at the University of Virginia, which was changed a year ago, that name. And this is one of the hard ones to be able to see, but he was entirely influential. Not only was he president of the University of Virginia, or acting as, they didn't have a president at that time, but he was the lead of the faculty at that time. But he actually gave this address that was published throughout the South. And this was what people were being fed, this sort of narrative about who they are. Now, Jefferson shaped America's narrative of white supremacy. I know many people see Jefferson, some of his early writings in particular, when he did, in fact, condemn slavery. So notes on the state of Virginia, written when he was relatively young, containing his most powerful indictments of slavery, right? But also, as Peter Onuf says, a foundational text of racism. So actually justifying this treatment of Blacks as inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. Now, saying it as a suspicion, but never in his life actually confronting that suspicion or denying that suspicion. And then, as Onuf said again, he didn't simply discover these boundaries. Many people say, well, he was a product of his time. He actually helped construct these racial boundaries and contributing to the racial science that naturalized this idea of a racial hierarchy of the Africans and African Americans being at the bottom of this hierarchy. And he also defined enslaved Americans as aliens, and they had to leave the United States. Again, he was actually an advocate and introduced legislation in Virginia early in his career that would end up ending slavery, but then later turned. He reversed, as president, he reversed John Adams' policy of support for the Haitian enslaved. And he also, as more commonly known, either kept or sold all the people he enslaved except a handful. The slaves basically freed by him in his lifetime or in his will were actually members of his immediate family. And the last element of Jefferson before I turn on, he had a long correspondence with William Short. William Short, somebody who actually identified as an adopted son of him. His solution to slavery was removal. We could not live together. It was impossible for us to live together. Whereas William Short was arguing that not only that we needed to offer the opportunities for Africans and African Americans to be able to demonstrate their capabilities to become farmers, but also to assimilate, that there would be natural, there already was this breeding because of the rape that was occurring, sexual violence that was occurring. But he thought this would actually be very natural for this to be able to come. Jefferson very much differing about that throughout his lifetime. And then even looking at Georgia in 1861, relying on Jefferson's words, saying, this is in their statement of succession, Mr. Jefferson condemned the restriction, and they're talking about the restriction on slavery in the Northwest Territory, foresaw its consequences, predicted it would result in the dissolution of the Union. So many people looking to Jefferson to actually provide support for slavery. Now, I had mentioned before Paul Behringer, head of the Faculty Senate for UVA, and I'm going to just take a minute to read this. And it's really hard to be able to read, but want people to understand how common this was for this language to be able to be used, and how people, white people, but also African Americans hearing this language too. so many components of this, being fed this language by someone who's in a position of power and a position of authority. And this idea that they're making, the idea that African Americans had benefited from slavery, from that condition, and then as soon as slavery was ended, they reverted to their natural state. And he passed this off as a form of science. So as I mentioned, Barringer, the Barringer Wing was actually named after him, and he is buried at the University of Virginia Cemetery with no context offered for that. The name was changed last year. Again, there's no context offered in the building about why that was done. White supremacy claims. So now we're going to look at some of the narrative and some of the harms from these and dig down to those, but I just want to pause a little bit and think of how common this is for so many white supremacists or people who've bought into the white supremacy narratives. And this is from one of the Unite the Right rally organizers, 2017. White Americans, he's equating us to Native Americans. We're being dispossessed of our territory. He's talking both literally, but he's also talking figuratively. And this is something that we have to combat. And this is why we have to understand why these narratives are being continued and why we need to confront them. So let's look at the violence of white supremacy. And again, I will remind you, feel free to pause, feel free to do whatever you need to do to be able to take care of yourself as we are covering some difficult subjects. So social control, African Americans maintained by violence, certainly from the time of slavery, but also after. And then new forms of violence occurring anytime gains towards equality made. Many white Americans have no ideas of the extent that systematic brutalities were imposed on people of African descent in the US, or how they were used to put down African Americans' own efforts, first to achieve freedom and to achieve equality. And the denial of this brutality, the forgetting of this brutality, has allowed each generation to witness different forms of violence whenever legal gains have been made. So the Equal Justice Initiative has identified some 4,000 lynchings of African Americans by mobs of whites. Dozens of lynchings took place in Virginia, and many people, I think, know that John Henry James took place, a city resident, took place in Albemarle County, and done in front of over 100 people, 100 white people, and yet nobody charged and nobody convicted. These lynchings were typically public events meant to demonstrate the inevitable power of white supremacy. So Ida B. Wells, many people might know her, and actually there's a film, I think, either coming out or is out already about her life, mostly living in Chicago. And again, one of the African Americans rising up and fighting against lynching, and asserting here that national crime is lynching, and saying it's not just an act of fever, but actually a calculating deliberation, that there's an unwritten law, that this act could be done. It's a great book by Sherilyn Ifill, who is the head of the chief legal officer for the NAACP, I'm thinking the legal arm of the NAACP. And this idea that actually she's asserting that racial terrorism and this history and the cover-up and the guilt that has happened in so many communities is actually where reconciliation and truth efforts must be targeted. I'm including this vision, these photos, because I wanted to show how common it was for these to be spectacles. And you can see that there are children there, right? So that white parents would bring their children, be able to see this, be able to learn this. And you can see some of the people grinning at these gruesome scenes, just to understand how commonplace this actually was. And then the violence of white supremacy, also collective violence. So many people have heard of some of these elements, but as you look at that history, every 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, you see violence against communities where African Americans are asserting their independence, asserting their freedom, asserting their control over and over and over again. And how many of you have heard the term sundown towns? So these were certainly not just in the South, thousands of communities that kept out African Americans. and sometimes called sundown towns because some of them posted signs at their city limits reading, don't let the sun go down on you. Many of these towns remain today largely all white. So efforts to exercise a right to vote, seek office were often squelched by the violence. That was the cause of some of the times when the people were expelled. And then finally, the denial of voting rights was formally enshrined. So in Virginia, the 1902 Constitution, mob violence was no longer needed to keep Blacks from voting and asserting their independence because it was enshrined in our Constitution and in law. So voter suppression could be enforced through the state. Now, the perverse, after demonstrating all of this violence that occurred on Black bodies, the perverse narrative, in fact, and then the harms from that perverse narrative, that in fact, that Blacks are more violent and dangerous than whites, and how common that narrative continues today. And what we see then, the impact of that, so innocent Blacks, 7 times more likely to be convicted of murder than innocent whites. Now these are people who were later, they were convicted and later exonerated. They were found not guilty because there was new evidence that was introduced. Black prisoners convicted of murder are 50% more likely to be innocent than other convicted murderers, 50%. And then convictions that led to murder exonerations with Black defendants, 22% more police misconduct. Now these are all judicial proceedings where there was actually demonstrated evidence and the convictions overturned. Who knows how many times that these convictions were not overturned, but they needed to be overturned. They deserved to be overturned. And nationally, African Americans are more likely than whites to be arrested for the same offenses, to spend time in jail while waiting trial, face juries that don't represent their community's racial demographics, not their own racial demographics, but the racial demographics of their communities, to be convicted of crimes for the same behaviors, or sentenced to longer prison terms for the same offenses, and to face the death penalty. Sort of an extraordinary statement. If we look locally at Charlottesville, just some of the harms of the narratives of violence and Black bodies not being respected in the same way. Black youth, 1.5 times more likely to be detained than white youth when being picked up for suspicion of a crime. 1.5 times more likely to be placed on probation when convicted, right? So this is being convicted for the same type of crime. They're more likely to be placed on probation. White juvenile offenders, 4 times more likely to be diverted from the justice system than Black juvenile offenders. The data then from the lead of the study, Dick Rapucci, if you look at kids, they're being picked up for the same thing, but many more Blacks end up linked to the system and then being stuck in the system. If we look at another element of this, the sexual violence of white supremacy. So this history directed against Blacks was commonplace. The lives, the lives of the enslaved included frequent sexual abuse, female slaves, commonly subject to the sexual whims of their owners and owners' families. Many males used as though they were not human beings with families and wills of their own, but livestock as breeding. Many females were raped and made pregnant, and their quote unquote mulatto offspring to be enslaved as well. This practice was actually enshrined in law in Virginia as long ago as 1662. This was commonly known. You can see stories in Charlottesville at the time of people knowing that. And Mary Chestnut, a pretty well-known white Southern diarist, noting how commonplace this was, the masters having their own children among the slaves. And yet the perverse narrative and the harms, the idea was that African Americans had the uncontrolled sexual appetites, despite the fact of being overwhelming victims of sexual violence. So this narrative supported, most of those lynchings actually took place over suspicion of sexual violence. And the harms that were done included not just lynching, but frequent castrations and mutilations. Today, Blacks convicted of sexual assault, 3.5 times more likely to be innocent than whites convicted. Again, these are people convicted whose convictions are later overturned. convicted but innocent of sexual assault even receive much longer prison sentences and spend almost 4.5 years longer in prison before they're exonerated. Education, white supremacy in education. So white supremacy and enslaved people were prohibited from learning, including learning to write. Following emancipation, though, African Americans fought for their education despite violent opposition by unrepentant Southern whites. Hundreds of schools and colleges for African Americans emerged in the South, some of them led by African Americans who'd been educated in the North, some by white Northern women and men who worked through religious institutions. Such education was often violently resisted by white supremacists, including the destruction of schools. And of course, this resistance continued to the time of separate equal. For funding for education for African Americans was never anywhere near equal. In Charlottesville, many people know this, in keeping with Virginia's white leadership policy of massive resistance, the schools were infamously closed by the governor. These were schools where the Black parents had successfully sued, and the judges had said, no, you have to open them. And so you have to open them to all students. And so rather than be in violation of the law, they simply closed the schools. And it took a long time for the harm that was done for that to be able to be recovered. White flight continues today to impact funding and other resources for education. We have that narrative again from Thomas Jefferson. So again, memory, Blacks being equal to white, in reason much inferior, imagination, dull, tasteless, and nonless. This is the language that he was being used, so-called science that he was demonstrating, anything but science, as we've learned later. Black children nationally, the harm today, white children attend schools with less experienced teachers, fewer opportunities for advanced classes, denied access to gifted programs, even with equivalent abilities, suspended, expelled, referred to law enforcement, or otherwise subject to discipline for the same offenses. This is the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. And then just in Charlottesville, people may remember just 2 years ago, the New York Times, "You are still Black, Charlottesville racial divide hindering students." So white students in Charlottesville almost 6 times more likely are to be in at least one AP class than Black students. On average, 3.5 grades behind white students. I know there's been work done since then, so recognizing that this is 2 years old, but it took national news to generate the attention and the energy and many parents working hard to be able to make these changes. Black students at the time almost 5 times as likely to be suspended as white students. The perverse narrative of education, of course, the false narrative, Blacks less intelligent, beneficiaries of special favors in education, not actually, on the one hand, they're undeserving of education. On the other hand, they get special favors in education, sort of being able to be caught at both ends. The pseudoscience, such as the bell curve, continuing such false claims, and this white fear of so many whites, affirmative action means that Blacks get preferences over whites. And just using the example of Hidden Figures, of the book and the film that so many people saw, how many African-American brilliant people did we deny education to, or did we deny opportunity to? And how much does that cost our society? How much does it cost those people too? Just my own university, and I haven't updated this, but in 2015, so I actually hear from students, if I ask in a class, how many people have heard that Black students get a preference to white students in getting into the University of Virginia? And they all raise their hand, white and Black, wherever they come from. Everyone has heard that. So in 2015, Virginia graduated 19,000 African Americans, about 22% of the total of graduates. UEA enrolled 244 African Americans in 2015, about 6.5% of all new admissions. That's disgraceful in and of itself, but never mind that. About 170 of those came from Virginia. So there are 170 students out of a class of 19,150 that entered UVA, and yet there's some 20,000 students, non-students of color, who did not get admission. And I know that many thousands of those have believe and tell their kids, or the kids learn that, well, they were kept out of UVA because someone got their position that didn't deserve it. So somehow these 170 people took 20,000 slots from the white people. It sounds strange, but I hear that over and over again. The economic harm of white supremacy. So we know about the wealth gap, how extraordinary it is, but just recognizing how enslaved people made possible the United States, the work that was done, cleared the lands, tilled the fields, did everything, entering vast wealth. Slave-grown cotton actually providing majority of American export earnings, and the value of the enslaved being higher than any other product in the United States. And just for people to understand too, much of the US university system was funded through profits from slavery, very much in the North, as much as in the South too. So this hard work being done and the economic harm, median household income for Blacks, less than 66% that of whites. Net worth, far less than that of whites. Twice as likely to be unemployed. That's dropped a little bit, but there's still quite a gap. So you can see it was over twice as much in 1980. 2010, of course, we had the Great Recession, but you can see that now it's slightly less than, as of August 2020, slightly less than twice as much, the unemployment. Twice as likely to be unemployed for longer periods, lesser paying occupations. And the perverse narrative that African Americans get preferences over whites, disparities of income and employment are their own fault. Robin DiAngelo, in her book about white fragility, tells a story of being in a group of managers, a large group of managers in a company, and one of the managers getting up, they're all white, getting up and being outraged and just saying, they're taking our jobs, and just looking around and saying, who are the people that are actually taking our jobs? And yet that is the narrative that you hear from so many people. Racial discrimination in hiring is demonstrated over and over. And then, of course, the further perversion of that claim. At my own University of Virginia, about 52% of the most physically demanding jobs, service and maintenance, are held by African Americans. A little over 4% faculty. Now, there's nothing wrong with physically demanding jobs. There's pride in those too. But there's also nothing wrong with being a faculty member. Why do we continue to have those disparities? And many of them working more than one job because they were not paid a living wage, although UVA did institute a living wage, credit to them, this last year. So Jordy Yeager, talking about housing. So some of you know this, so just to go over it briefly, neighborhoods more segregated by race than 50 years ago. Fewer people of color owning their own homes than whites. Blacks buying less expensive and yet having more debt first homes than white home buyers. And then typically buy homes later in life on average than white households, and less likely to be able to sustain their home ownership. So when the Great Recession hit, it hurt African Americans and other people of color far more than it did whites. In Charlottesville, so Charlottesville discrimination included redlining, as Jordy talked about, this idea of preferences for loans, or the inability of actually be able to get loans in African American neighborhoods. Whites only homeownership deeds that would prevent African Americans from purchasing properties. African American neighborhoods, Pearl Street, Gospel Hill, Vinegar Hill, taken by eminent domain, other means. So it's typical racial restriction. That future home of Lane High School, that was Pearl Street, an African American community, taken by eminent domain. And in 2005, our metropolitan area ranked as the worst in the whole country for racial differences in high cost loans. Whites getting 11.1% in high interest home loans, and blacks 43% of those. Health, medical experimentation, black bodies being devalued. Marion Sims, gynecological surgery, slavery, medicine, medical publishing, a synergistic partnership, establishing the field of gynecology. This myth that Black bodies actually feel less pain. Our own community, the anatomical theater that was part of Jefferson's University, no longer there, but the depended on grave robbing, and typically African Americans far more than whites for that was done. This again, the devaluing of Black bodies that we had. The harms from health. Blacks receive less favorable treatment, fewer referrals, worse care than whites for about 40% of measures, worse access to care than whites for 1/3 of those measures. This is in a report published by the government. Just looking at our death rates from COVID through September 15th, 1 in 1,000, basically 97.9 deaths per 100,000. For Indigenous Americans, we certainly heard a lot about that, still incredibly bad, but actually not even as bad as for Black Americans. Pacific Islander Americans, Latinx Americans, and white Americans. Now, all of those deaths are tragic. But why do we have those racial disparities? Asian Americans actually the least. If you look at it a different way, if we'd had the same rate of death as white Americans, you'd have 20,800 Black people, 10,900 Latinx people, 700 Indigenous people, and about 80 Pacific Islander Americans that would still be alive. Locally looking at infant mortality. This is the last year that I could actually get this sort of collective because it varies year for year. So you need to look at over a period of time. So the overall rate, 4.5 infants, lower for white infants rather, lower than Virginia. So almost 4 times that for African-American babies, which is higher than Virginia and the US rates. Here in Charlottesville, where we have 2 major medical facilities. Whoops, let me go back to that. And just going back to what Dr. Beverly Adams talked about, the subtle acts of exclusion more than microaggressions. Dr. Norm Oliver, who used to be at the University of Virginia, who's now our State Commissioner of Health, actually has given presentations about the indicators of stresses of everyday racism. Again, what Dr. Adams calls subtle acts of exclusion, are basically the most likely, most useful theory of why we see these disparities of infant mortality, the stresses of dealing with the everyday racism, this community. We do not see, it's not genetic, we do not see that for African immigrants that come to the United States, there's no racial disparity in those two. Why do we have that? Why do we accept that? So what can I do? And going back, those of you that came on early enough to see this, how do we break that chain of transmission? This idea from The Unmaking of a Racist by Charles Dew. This honest confrontation with our history. The best way to start. Peeling away the multiple layers of myths, looking at our embrace squarely in the face. Our acceptance, certainly slavery and Jim Crow, but today, the stereotypes, the harm that's being done. Can we get rid of them? How can we do that? So when people of color ask for support, just say yes. I'm not comfortable in big places with lots of people. I'm not comfortable with chanting, but when I get invited to come to a rally, I go. I show up as much as I can. My wife and I do that. COVID has changed that, but we've still been able to do some in our car to be able to do that. We just say yes to that. Speak out, be an upstander, and learn safe and effective intervention. There are a lot of trainings that help you be able to do that. The former vice mayor of Charlottesville, Wes Bellamy, has a new book out. When white supremacy shows up, basically you have to confront it. That's not the exact title, but it's a close paraphrase of that. So an example of that, May 14th, 2017, in the image there, following the May 13th Torchlight white supremacist rally, people showing up saying we're not going to accept that. So many good books. The New Jim Crow, Just Mercy, Slavery by Another Name, White Fragility, How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's not hard. Go to the local bookstore. Go, support the local bookstores. There's a couple of them, a used bookstore in the downtown mall, I'm forgetting the name, and New Dominion bookstore. There's so many ways that you can educate yourself. No longer can we say we didn't know, because we do know now. And then be able to build and grow lasting coalitions wherever you are. I know many people, many neighborhoods are having discussion groups and action groups around race, places of worship, schools, workplaces, civil society, places like the center at Belvedere. We can reclaim these racist community spaces as non-racist and create new anti-racist spaces. So people may know removal of the Johnny Reb statue in front of the Albemarle County Courthouse, which took years of advocacy for that to be able to come, and also advocacy to actually change the law to actually permit that to be able to happen. So this takes time, it takes commitment, it takes energy. The memorial to enslaved laborers, we already showed the photo of that. So creating new anti-racist spaces as well. Support the African American Heritage Center, Jefferson School Heritage Center. In a minute, I will put the chat with the links to this, so don't feel as though you have to be typing furiously to be able to get that. This is a great place for education, and also this was before, when the Ku Klux Klan came to town, in that morning before that, them holding this event that they had there. UCARE, a weekly newsletter for news and events pertaining to racial equity. Charlottesville Community Cares newsletter, you can subscribe to that. Gives updates about issues of race and equity. And then the Charlottesville Clergy Collective newsletter. All of these providing opportunities for people to be able to see the events such as this one, such as other events that are occurring, and ways of joining people together. Read the report and support the recommendations of Charlottesville's Blue Ribbon Commission on Race, Memorials, and Public Spaces. It has a tremendous amount of history. John Mason, UVA history professor, and I'm just blanking out because I'm tired. I can't believe I can't think of her name. Our local, Linda, please, can you put it in the chat box? Local historian also, who able to do a tremendous amount of work to understand our history there. There's actually a couple hundred pages of history. And Andrea Douglas, of course, being on it as well. And then another one, choose from the 103 things white people can do for racial justice at Medium. So again, I'm going to post these in just a minute. And the last slide I'm going to leave you with. There's an effort by people to actually create a Truth and Transformation Commission for Charlottesville. We've been holding the meetings until COVID hit at the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center with lots of different people involved in this. And this idea that we actually need to restore what was taken, these stories, the humanity, the community, the wealth that was taken, responsibility for confronting our legacy of harm, compensating, this idea of reparation. What would actually reparations look like locally? What would it look like within my church community if we were to name that harm that we did, within my neighborhood, within the school system, within my university? How do we actually do that? And to reconcile the past with our present. Ta-Nehisi Coates, talking about reparations divide us no more than we are already divided. Wealth gap, other gaps, they just put a number on something we feel but can't say. That our prosperity was ill-gotten, selective. We need this airing of family secrets, a healing of our psyche, the banishment of white guilt. The last part, he also talks about, we invoke the words of Jefferson and Lincoln because they say something about our legacy and our traditions. We recognize our links to the past, at least when they flatter us. But unfortunately, Black history doesn't flatter American democracy. I would say white history doesn't flatter it either. So Black nationalists have always perceived something unmentionable about America that integration in this dare not acknowledge. White supremacy is not just a work of hot-headed demagogues or a matter of false consciousness, but a force so fundamental, it's difficult to imagine the country without it, and yet people are doing so. So many people are actually being able to do that. I don't have an ability to write so many, but so many of the speakers, you can support the other groups. So the Tamara Wilkerson, with the African American Teaching Fellows, Chantel Bingham, who spoke with the Food Justice Network, Harold Foley with Legal Aid, Lisa Drain and Jordy Yeager with the African American Heritage Center, and of course the Center at Belvedere putting on this series. So I'm going to stop the sharing now, and I'm going to share the links that I have and then wait to hear from, yes, Jane Smith. I'm so sorry, Jane. If you're on here, please forgive me. Jane being the other historian on the commission and contributing along with John Mason to that history that we have from there. So I'm going to turn it back over to Enid and see if we have any questions. And I see we still have 92 people. I was afraid I was going to leave everybody.
Oh no,
I
think everyone has been riveted to your outstanding explanation of this topic. There is a couple of requests. So would you please put the Barringer slide back up? They thought we had expected you to read it aloud, and some people were trying to get it, but it went away too fast. So if you could put that back up,
okay.
People could see it.
Let me see if I can, let me go back first while I'm doing that. Let me go back and not try to go back on the screen while everybody's watching. And watch me go back, let's see, so Barringer. Here we go.
Okay. And while we're waiting for that, there was a comment from Mary, very, very pertinent comment, that sexual violence is also extremely commonplace today in Indian country in both the United States and Canada. So many Native women and girls go missing and are murdered. Sex traffic of Natives is huge today. And most importantly, there is no national database of these crimes. So if you see a Native with a red handprint across a person's mouth, this is to honor those Native women and girls that are missing or dead. That's great. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary. And I will say Canada, which shares white Canada, well, the racial history has done a far better job, although still have a long ways to go, at recognizing this harm and the harm that was done by residential schools, the sexual violence that was propagated there. We have our own history, but so few people have some understanding of that. But thank you, Mary, very much for sharing that.
That's great. There is also a comment from Scott Danielson, who's one of our participants. He says, I just started a new business in Charlottesville with Schooley Mitchell. We provide cost reduction services to small, medium, and larger sized businesses. I started in this business partly because I was trying to figure out how I could do my part in creating racial equality in this country. I'm not much of a protester or a marcher, but I do believe that economic equality is an important piece on the road to racial equality. That is why I chose this business and am focusing on helping minority-owned businesses save money to help them grow their businesses and improve economies within minority and Black communities. I'm just getting started, so if anyone wants to help me provide support to these businesses, I'm certainly open to getting some help. After this webinar, I can be reached at, and I hope you're all got your pencils, Scott.Danielson at SCHOOLEYMITCHELL.com. That looks like Scott.Danielson at SchooleyMitchell.com. If anyone wants to reach out so that we can make this better. Thank you very much, Scott, for adding that.
Thank you. And there is there are a number of resources for Black businesses and not only African American businesses, but especially because of the discrimination that they've had before. But Piedmont Virginia Community College has a work program. There are other programs as well for people to be able to participate in.
That's great. Another thing that you all of our listeners may want to know is that some of those recommended books that Frank showed are currently in the library at the center. We have been working on the library, improving the content in terms of making it a little bit more diverse, and several of those books are in the library. So you can.
If it's okay with you, I'm going to stop the sharing. I don't want to give the privilege to Barringer's words. I think one of the concerns that I've had is that This is so much about the harm, which is appropriate, but it's less about the resilience. It's less about the resistance. It's less about the community building by people of color, by the African American community, and so much that has been done that too. So I'm fine to, you know, include those words. We need to understand them, but I also don't want to center those words.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Any other questions? I'm looking.
You know, some of them are coming to me privately, so if you don't
Okay.
mind, Enid, I'll share.
Oh, go ahead.
From Geeta, I am in diversity work and just gave a talk yesterday on reparations. What are your thoughts on reparations?
Well, that last slide that I had demonstrated, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote a very influential article several years ago in the Atlantic magazine, you can go back and look at that as well. I think it's actually pretty remarkable. At the time, so many people absolutely dismissing that, but we're actually seeing not only a call nationally for reparations, but we're seeing communities that are stepping up and saying, we have to do this as a community. I'm forgetting the name of the community in Illinois outside of Chicago, which is dedicating a new tax that they have. That money is going to be used for local reparations, local repair, to be identified by the community members. I would love to see, and as I mentioned, there are people that are working on this idea of a Truth and Transformation Commission. But and all of us that are working on that say that reparations needs to be part of that. And we can't wait for the federal government to name that, partly because not all the harm was done at the federal level, right? The harm that was done locally. What would repair look like locally? And I would love to see that. How could that be identified by people, not to privilege only people who've been here for generations, but we know there are people who've been here for generations who have stories that need to be told, stories that we all need to hear. And part of those stories involve the harms that are done. So what is the cost of that and how do we repair that? So I think that the idea of reparations is not a radical idea. I think it's actually a just idea and something that we can get behind. And I think a lot of people are concerned, a lot of white people are concerned about it. And I would say not only white people, this idea of a handout, right? I don't think we need to be looking at giving handouts. I think we can see the harm that's actually done and how can you actually calculate that harm and then make sure that those reparations are coming to the people that need it the most. I'm confident that we can actually do that. We are smart, we're capable, we can actually do that, we can name that, and we can create that.
There's Beverly Adams is asking a question. She says, there's a good bit of discussion of Black trauma experienced by Black people. What do you think about the concept of white trauma experienced by white people due to generational guilt?
Yeah, I think that you saw Sherilyn Ifill, that book about On the Courthouse Lawn, the story of lynching, where she identifies that very much, that element of that harm. You know, it's a different type of harm, but I'm confident that it exists for people and it can paralyze people. I think a lot of white people just want to not have to deal with any of this, right? So I'm white, identify as white. We'd rather run from it, not just because of the guilt, but also because of the sort of overwhelming sense of what is it that we can do. But you're seeing so many people. And also, if you don't know what to do, just listen to people of color. You know, we're being told what to do. We can support that. You know, I'm not a therapist, so I don't understand the full extent of that trauma, but I don't doubt that that exists. I don't doubt that we would be better off with the telling of these stories that we have. And I'll say something, I will say something about that, Beverly, too. I think that if you look at communities that are addressing these harms, or rather, let me put it another way around, communities that don't address these wounds, they end up repeating them over and over again. They don't recover, they're not resilient. So one reason why Charlottesville, we had such a hard time recovering from 2017, because we never fully addressed the harms of race that have come there. And once we are able to do that, I think we will become more resilient. I'm not looking at tearing down our community. I know some people see this as a way of doing that. I'm not looking at doing that. I'm saying that we, once we can understand all the dimensions of our history and why our history impacts our present, then we can start acting on it. And when we act on that, we have a sense of agency, and that trauma can be taken away from that. I know some people think of, oh, healing, it's sort of squirrely or what's the word, soft, too soft. And we're not talking about the sort of healing where a soft type of healing. We're talking about a healing where you actually look at the wound and you look at what caused that wound and you look at the sources of that wound and you make sure that wound doesn't worsen, and then you make sure that that wound is taken care of. So that was a great question. Thank you. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, but I know we're not really, it's not really what we're here for, but I'm sure you know more than I do as a psychologist.
Let's see. Oh, Michelle has given us some information. William Sandy Darity has written extensively on reparations. There's someone who asked a question about reparations, and this might be a good resource for that. And also, Jim Hasmer is explaining that reparations are due to our indigenous peoples as well as African Americans. I would agree.
Yeah, and I should say locally, the group that has been working on this, which was slowed down because of COVID, so but we'll be picking up again, absolutely says we need to encompass the indigenous story and the indigenous history here. We cannot ignore that, because it is a part of our history just as much as slavery, as much as everything else with our history.
Absolutely. Carolyn, did you get any more questions privately? I don't have any more.
Just a lot of excellent job. Thank you so much.
Good job. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank, for sharing this information. Can you offer suggestions or ideas on how to start community conversation and engagement about race and equality?
Well, I think actually, if you're talking community-wide, we've had those periodically. We had the dialogues on race that many people participated in. There's nothing of that sort that's going on now, but there are many, many different types of groups that are happening now. For white people, the group called SURGE, Showing Up for Racial Justice, offers periodic trainings. I don't know, I'm sorry, not trainings, periodic conversations. And I'm not sure where they at in this time of COVID, whether they're still doing those online. The African American Heritage Center, if you simply go to the Heritage Center, to different presentations that they have, they're constantly having conversations. It's just an incredible resource for this community. Credit to all the people there, and Andrea Douglas in particular, for that. So I guess I would say that is a great place to start, but also places of faith. I've heard of so many different church groups that are doing this. My own spouse is leading a conversation group for people in my church that starts tomorrow night, has done this a number of times. I know that there are other congregations, not just churches, that do that as well. So I'm not sure that I want to give any one particular, group to be able to priority over any other one. But obviously you're here, you're at the center, at the series, so stay tuned. I'm sure the center is not going to stop right here, right? I'm putting
Absolutely
you on the spot, Carolyn and Enid.
Yeah.
It's not, we're not on a spot, we're on a roll.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
Not to worry.
Thank you.
Yep.